There it was again. Jeremy put his hands over his ears and tried to block the noise out, but the scratching against the hardwood sent chills up his spine. Stop it! Stop it right now! Jeremy clapped his hands over his mouth, terrified at what he had just done. The scratching under his bed had been happening for 3 weeks. The scratching, the weird noises, and sometimes he thought he heard whispers and whimpers amongst the odd sounds. His parents had said, "Oh, you're just dreaming," or "It's just the house settling." But Jeremy knew that it was something. There was something under there. He knew it in that way that children always know. The scratching stopped, and he lay there, silently shivering with the covers pulled up to his chin. He had done it now. Now it would slink out from under his bed and eat him up. It would come towering out from under the bed and hurt him with its long claws, or... "Who's there?" said a small voice that was trying to be brave. Jeremy jumped. That had been a child's voice. The thing under his bed had spoken, and it was a kid, like him. He peeked over the edge of the bed, expecting yellow eyes or a mouthful of pointy teeth, but no one peeked out from under his bed. After a few seconds of heavy silence, Jeremy decided to be brave for a little while longer. I'm Jeremy Bird. Why have you been under my bed all these nights making noise?" "Me? You're the terrifying thing that's been making noise under my bed this whole time," said the voice. To Jeremy, it sounded terrified. "No, I haven't," Jeremy said, and he laughed at the absurdity. "Oh, yes, you have. You growl and roar deep in the night. I've heard you," said the monster, who was blustering with angry terror. Jeremy thought for a moment. "Does it sound like this?" He pretended to snore. He'd gotten pretty good at it if he wanted to trick his parents so they could stay up a little later. The monster quailed in terror. "Oh no, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "Shh, that's the noise I make when I sleep, silly," Jeremy said with a laugh. "Oh," said the monster, relieved. But what about that terrible squealing you make?" it added suspiciously. Jeremy thought about it, and as he thought, he leaned back on the bed, and the springs creaked and groaned. It chills me every time I hear it," said the monster with real terror. "That's just the mattress," Jeremy said. He was becoming less afraid of this monster, as it proved to be more fearful of him. "Well, what about those little noises you make at night? They're so invasive, they make me want to scream." Jeremy thought, what could the creature be talking about? He looked at the glow of the dark stars on his ceiling as he contemplated, and smiled as he remembered how his mom had pasted them up there. What small noises late at night could this creature be talking about? He thought and thought, and his silence made the monster cry a little, a high-pitched whine at the back of his throat that made Jeremy cringe. Those are whimpers," Jeremy realized suddenly, understanding the noise as soon as he heard it. "Why do you make that sound?" the monster asked, but Jeremy already knew the answer. "Because I'm scared of you," he said, feeling a tear slip down his cheek as he lay in his bed, a child's fear coming over him that his parents would never understand, and because no one believes me. There was silence for a minute. "I'm sorry," said the monster in a small little voice. Jeremy felt himself smile a little. "It's okay. I don't think you meant to scare me. It's just in your... No, not for that. Well, I am sorry for that, but I'm more sorry for what's about to happen to you." Jeremy tensed. "What do you mean?" "Well, I had 2 monsters, the one in my closet and you. When I told the closet monster I was more afraid of you than him, he told me that he could make you go away. He told me that if I distracted you, he'd catch you off guard and make sure you never scared me again." Jeremy was silent. "I'm sorry. Please, won't you forgive me?" Jeremy didn't answer. "Hello? Are you still there? Please don't be mad at me. I'm sorry." But Jeremy would never answer. The only sound to be heard was the soft drip on the floor and the closet door scratching as it was pulled shut from the inside. She died very suddenly, though none of us could have known what lay inside her. Her name was Kimmy Wynn, and she was from Korea or Singapore, somewhere like that. We never learned much about Kimmy. Her family didn't speak very good English, though, but Kimmy spoke it well enough to understand the lessons. We tried to befriend her, but Kimmy was shy, and I'm ashamed to say that we took to bullying her. We were in elementary school and extremely cliquey. Kimmy was an outsider. She wore strange clothes. She didn't speak like we did, and we made fun of her for it. Most days, she just sat in the back of class, sat on the pavilion at recess, and said little to nothing. When she died, it surprised everyone. Kimmy lived in a small apartment complex in a not-so-great part of town. Her family worked for her uncle, Mr. June, who owned a market in the neighborhood they lived in. Kimmy had been working there after school, helping her parents pay the bills, and she'd been making a delivery on her bike when someone had abducted her. They found her bike just sitting on the curb, wheels spinning slowly, and the police didn't seem hopeful in their investigations. Her kidnapping was all the buzz around school, and my friends wanted to talk about little else. Marissa, our sort of leader, said she bet that Kimmy had just made the whole thing up so that people would be friends with her after she was found. Leanna said that she shouldn't say things like that, but you could tell she didn't really feel very scandalized. She said she'd be praying for her, praying that they'd find her safe, but even at 10, I doubted it. I kept my mouth shut on the matter, personally thinking it was terrible. No one should just be grabbed off their bike as they tried to help their family. A week later, they found her body in an empty lot near her uncle's shop. Mom wouldn't let me watch the news report about it, but Marissa said that the newsman had said that she was chopped into little pieces and left there. The news thinks it might have been something to do with her uncle, but they don't seem to know much about it. A service was held for her at the local Korean Baptist church, and I saw a picture of her parents lighting a little paper boat and floating it out for her. Her two sisters, one of whom was in the first grade, were there too, and I remember thinking how awful it would be to lose someone like that. My own sister wasn't very nice, but I still didn't want anything like that to happen to her. A few days later, Miss Hurd stopped me as I was going out to recess and asked if I would put the stuff from Kimmy's desk into a box. Her parents are coming at the end of the day, and I really need to be outside with the other children. Just put it on my desk and come outside when you're done. I saw the pack of Marlboros in her hand and guessed that child-minding probably wasn't the only thing on her mind. Marissa stayed to help me, and I found that Kimmy's desk was surprisingly neat. My desk looked like a garage sale, but Kimmy's desk was very organized, and it was easy to pack her stuff away. Marissa cooed over her Hello Kitty pencil box, but I reminded her that we weren't allowed to take her stuff. The pencil box, her notebooks, her folders, and a cute little art supply case went into the box too, along with a Hello Kitty eraser and a pencil set. Marissa looked over it all greedily, but I wasn't trying to get in trouble for taking anything from a dead student, especially not when the teacher had trusted me to pack it. We were loading some of her notebooks when a small purple book fell out of the middle of them. Marissa pounced on it before I could even fully register what it was. I told her to give it back, that it didn't belong to her, but Marissa was already opening it and leafing through it. "Oh, no way! It's her journal! Give it, Marissa. It isn't yours. We need to put it in the box before someone sees it." "No way. No one knows about it, so who's going to miss it? Unless..." Marissa got a mean look on her face. "You're going to tattle on me." I stopped complaining then and let her slide the journal into her pocket. Marissa and I had been friends since first grade, but I hadn't forgotten how mean she could be either. She had bullied me in kindergarten for the better part of the first half of the year, until I'd come to school with a brand new backpack one day, and she had fallen in love with it. Marissa had said someone with a backpack that cool had to be friends with her and Leanna, and I had been part of their clique ever since. That had only been 3 years ago, though, and I wasn't in a big hurry to go back to the way things had been. Marissa and I were friends, but Marissa could be mean when she wanted to be. I won't tattle," I said softly, more to myself than to her. "Good," she said, snatching the pencil case out before I could get the lid on. I set the box on the desk, and I made sure that Marissa was out of the classroom before I left. I didn't want her doubling back to grab anything else out of there. The idea to make the Chatterbox was Marissa's, as so many other bad ideas usually were. She read the journal to us at recess, taking delight every time she or Leanna were mentioned. My name came up a few times, though it was usually by association, It appeared that Kimmy had been keeping a journal of people and how they had wronged her, as well as how they had wronged others. Quite the little spider was Kimmy, hiding away and listening to people as they gossiped or went about their lives. Marissa said, getting a mischievous look. I've got an idea. She turned to the back and tore out an unused page, beginning to write the predictions for her Chatterbox. If you're unfamiliar with the item, it's probably because it has a million names. I've heard them called fortune tellers, whirlybirds, paku paku, salt sellers, cootie catchers, and any number of other things. Sometimes when I post about them online, I get little fights started over what they're called. People have 1,000 different names for them, but they seem to be something known worldwide. They are little devices that you put numbers in, picking numbers randomly until you get your fortunes and learn your fate. Marissa had already started writing the same old things she always wrote on the wedges anytime she made one of these. They were never very creative, usually things like you'd marry a millionaire, that you'd be a princess, that you'd have 20 children, that sort of thing. She was always very predictable, but she never seemed to include anything bad in her predictions. Marissa, despite being a bit of a brat, didn't like for bad things to happen to her or her friends. When she made the Chatterbox, it was always the best outcomes. Okay, pick a number. I looked at the Chatterbox questioningly. What are you doing? Isn't it obvious? If Kimmy knew so many secrets, then maybe she won't mind telling us our future. The idea of using a dead girl's paper to tell our fortunes made me shudder, and I shook my head as she turned to Leanna. Come on, Lee, let me tell your future. I guess it couldn't hurt, Leanna said. 5. Marissa opened and closed the device very fast, before holding out for her to pick another number. 7, she said, smiling a little as the paper creature plopped open and closed very quickly. 3, she finished, and Marissa opened the flap. You should tell Jana what you... But Marissa stopped suddenly. She seemed to realize that she had read words before she had quite put together what they had said. Tell Jana what? Leanna said, smiling but looking a little nervous. Marissa looked at me. Did you write something on this while I wasn't looking? No. When would I have had a chance? Marissa started to call me a liar, but she huffed out a hey as Leanna took the Chatterbox and looked at the tab. She looked confused when she got the Chatterbox away from her, but she looked angry after she read what was on the tab. You should tell Jana what you did to Mark at the lake. She tossed the little paper thing in Marissa's lap. I told you that in confidence. I only kissed him because you said that I should. Lee, I didn't write that. But Leanna was already storming away, heading for the picnic tables. Marissa looked back at me, holding the paper craft out as though inviting me to take my turn. I don't really want to do it. It feels kind of creepy. Oh my God, Marissa groaned, deep in her throat. Here, I'll do it. She picked numbers at random, moving her fingers very quickly as she selected her fortune. Marissa looked mad, furious even, but that didn't seem to stop her from selecting numbers and finding out what her fortune might be. The fortune that Leanna had read had shocked her, and she was interested in finding the ones that she had written so she could feel okay again. It was a fluke, she must be thinking, and now she was going to prove it. She opened tab number 3, and I could see her hands shaking as she read it. Felicia doesn't like you. She pretended to, because her mom asked her to. She looked at me suspiciously, but I just put my hands up and looked at the words inside. It's not even either of our handwritings. Your handwriting is swoopy, and mine is super sloppy. This handwriting is way too neat to be either of ours. Marissa looked at the handwriting, and then flipped open the journal as if looking for the source of it. She stared at a few of the pages before slamming the book shut and taking the Chatterbox with her. I asked her where she was going, but she didn't answer. Turns out she was going on a tour of the playground. I didn't realize what was going on until a group of angry kids approached the playground monitor with a frantic Marissa in tow. The lead girl, Felicia Spaulding, looked livid, and Marissa was trying to tell her how sorry she was with every step she took. Miss Conway, Marissa's telling lies about my friends and me. Miss Conway, a broad, beefy, grandmotherly woman with hands like slabs of meat, looked at Marissa and then back to Felicia. What's going on, girls? What's this about lies? I didn't write it, Marissa wailed. waving the Chatterbox with her free hand. "She wrote lies about us in her Chatterbox. Her box said that my mom had gotten an abortion and that Cindy was adopted." Cindy, the tall girl with the wavy brown hair that hung with Felicia in her clique, was crying and shaking her head. Other kids had similar stories. Some said that her Chatterbox had told them that their parents were getting divorced. Others said that it had said it knew things that they had done, or things they had said. One of them even claimed that it told him that his aunt would die later that week, and that she was in the hospital with cancer. "Marissa, hand that thing over," Miss Conway said, her face growing dour as she listened to the long list of complaints against Marissa. Marissa gave her the folded paper, both hesitant and loath to be rid of it, and she almost cried out in anguish as Miss Conway tore it into pieces. "Next time I hear of something like this, I'll give you after-school detention. Stop writing lies about people, and the rest of you go play." They all dispersed, Marissa looking down at the pieces of the Chatterbox as they drifted in the wind. I hadn't walked up with the rest, but I was still close enough to hear Felicia tell her not to expect to go to any of her parties anymore. Marissa changed after that, and it seemed to me that the Chatterbox was the reason for it. For the rest of the day, she just sat at her desk and looked down at her lap. I couldn't see what she was fiddling with at first, but eventually I saw it was another one of the Chatterboxes. I was shocked. Hadn't she learned her lesson after the first one? Her book was open, but her hands moved below the lip of the desk in a rapid series of jerks and swoops. She would flick it once, twice, 3 times before opening the corresponding flap and reading what it said. Every answer seemed to make her more and more agitated. She would take it off her hands sometimes and seemed on the verge of ripping it to shreds before gently sliding it back on and starting again. "Marissa, would you care to answer number 4 for us?" Miss Hurd asked, drawing my attention back to the front of the class and drawing Marissa out of her stupor. Marissa shoved the Chatterbox under her desk and looked down at her open textbook as she searched for number 4. 17? Miss Hurd blinked. "That would be correct if we were still on our math lesson. We've moved on to geography. Are you feeling well, Marissa? You don't seem like yourself today." Marissa turned beet red, digging through her desk to find her book. Miss Hurd had approached her desk, I suppose wanting to see if she might be feverish, and when she stooped to pick something up, I saw that the Chatterbox had tumbled out of her desk as Marissa looked for her book. "Oh, what have we here? I remember these from when I was a little girl. We used to use them to tell each other's fortunes. I can't believe kids still make these for..." But as she had been talking, she had opened one of the flaps on the Chatterbox. She glanced at the tab as it came fully open, and her words ended as abruptly as they had begun. Marissa looked up at her as her geography book came open, and the look on her face was enough to tell me that she didn't like what she saw there. "Get up," Miss Hurd whispered, her voice barely containing her rage. Miss Hurd?" Marissa asked, unsure what was happening. "Get your..." She curbed her next words. "Things, and come with me. We're going straight to the principal's office, young lady." Marissa looked up, confused, but collected her things and went with Miss Hurd to the office. She never came back to class, and when I asked Miss Hurd, she only told me that her mother had been called after something she had written in the Chatterbox. Marissa was suspended for 5 days. She was taken out of class and put in another 4th grade class, away from Leanna and I. Leanna said it served her right for writing lies about people. She made her bed, and now she has to sleep in it. I would have honestly forgiven her, but not after what she said about Miss Hurd. I asked her what she had said, and Leanna leaned in like it was some big secret. "I heard that she had written that Miss Hurd was cheating on her husband with Mr. Sizemore." "The PE teacher?" "Yeah, can you imagine? She's lucky she didn't get expelled." When Marissa came back to school, she was a very different girl. She looked frazzled, her red hair looking unkempt. She seemed to be constantly pulling at her clothes. She was nervous and twitchy, and she seemed obsessed with the little Chatterbox. She would ask people to pick a space, ask them to make a choice, but most people would just walk past her without speaking. It's tough to be labeled a social pariah at 10 years old. She had lost all of her friends, except for me, and I wasn't even sure I still wanted to be her friend. When I saw her at recess that day, sitting by the fence and fiddling with the chatterbox. I sat beside her and asked if she was okay. I could smell a smell around her, and it wasn't an altogether healthy smell. "I can't let her beat me," she whispered, her face very close to the chatterbox as she worked the mechanism. "Who?" I asked. "Kimmy," she said, just as low, and when she opened the fold on the chatterbox, she sobbed and closed it again before starting. "Mara, Kimmy's dead," I said, using her nickname to try to bring her back to her senses. "Not all the way dead," she said, and when she opened the tab this time, her fingers crumpled the space, and I could read the message written there just before she closed it. "Your mother thinks you're crazy." Marissa pushed me suddenly, and the fence scratched my back as I slid sideways. Through the tears that welled in my eyes, I could see her lunatic's face as she pushed it inches from mine. "That's not your fortune. Don't read other people's fortunes." Miss Conway must have seen something, because she started walking over. I got up and walked away quickly, not looking at Marissa as the playground monitor approached her. That was the last time I spoke to Marissa, but not the last time I saw her. For the next 3 months, I saw her on and off. She became like a wraith who haunted the school. She stopped asking people to look at the chatterbox. She just sat off by herself and played with it, cringing and sobbing every time she opened a flap. The more I saw her, the worse I felt for her, and eventually I decided to try and bury the hatchet. I decided that after school I would go visit her at home and try to see if we could reconcile. I also wanted to see if there was any sanity left in her to save. She hadn't been at school the last couple of days, not that anyone but me had bothered to notice. When I arrived at her house, her mother seemed happy to see me. She told me that Marissa had been feeling poorly lately, and that maybe a friend might cheer her up. Marissa's mother looked like she hadn't slept in a few days, and even at 10, I noticed that she approached Marissa's room like there might be a wild animal behind the door. She knocked, slow and hesitant, and told Marissa that I was here to see her. Marissa said nothing. She knocked again, asking if Marissa was awake. Marissa said nothing. Her mother opened the door slowly, and I could see Marissa sitting at the desk with her back to the door. She never moved when her mother walked over to her, and as I stood in the doorway, I couldn't help but take in what appeared to be the lair of a crazy person. Some of the details would come to me afterward, but many of them were seen in the split second that we often use to see details and assess if a person is a threat or not. The floor was full of chatterboxes, like a flower bed of folded paper, and her mother seemed to be stepping over them gingerly. The outside of them were covered with words, all of them written in that neat, spidery handwriting. The writing on the wall was all Marissa's, though. She had written on the wall in anything she could find. The scrawls were a messy jumble of pen, pencil, paint, charcoal, and even rusty red colors that might have been her own blood in a few places. The words were strange, not making a lot of sense. She watches. She whispers. She tells me, "I'm crazy. I'm insane. I'm a disappointment." She haunts me. Most chilling of all was the rusty red smear of the word Kimmy over the head of her bed, like she had traced it with a bleeding finger. When her mother started to scream, I was turned away from the bloody words as if someone had slapped me. She was screaming Marissa's name again and again, shaking the ragged scarecrow that she had become. She begged me to dial 911, and I ran downstairs to do just that. The paramedics couldn't figure it out. They said it was like her heart had just stopped, and no amount of CPR or defibrillation could bring her back. As they laid her out on the ground, I could see her face frozen in a rictus of fear and shock. Looking to the desk, I saw the chatterbox she had been toting around. It was grimy, covered in fingerprints, but I believe to this day that it was the same one that Miss Conway had destroyed all those weeks ago. The open flap was blank, the surface stark and unmarred. I can't imagine what she could have read there, and I honestly didn't want to find out. I'm in high school now. 8 years have passed, but I still remember the lesson I learned from Marissa. It's unwise to mess around with the possessions of the dead. Their things are better left undisturbed, their memories left unread. It was the last lesson Marissa would ever learn, and she learned it too late. If it's a lesson I ever forget, I have a reminder on my desk every day. You see, when I came home from Marissa's funeral, the Chatterbox was sitting on my doorstep. I can't prove it was the same one. I know that it can't be the same one, but that didn't stop me from scooping it up and putting it in my pocket before my mother could see it. I heard it whisper to me that night. Its whispering is little more than a mutter as I sit here writing. It's harder to hear, but it never goes away. That's why I refuse to touch it, let alone use it. Let Marissa and Kimmy keep each other company inside that thing for the rest of time, for all I care. I don't want the knowledge they hold that badly. I pulled up in front of the shop and had to recheck my directions. It was a dingy little hole-in-the-wall place between a Dollar General and a computer repair shop. It looked like it had just existed here since the creation of the first VHS tape. The windows were covered in thick yellow paper, and the outside was caked with a film of old dirt. The sign on the door read "Open," but it was barely visible through the dirty windows. There was no way this place was what I wanted. When I was a kid, I remember watching a show called Children of Man. As a kid, the premise of the show appealed to me. The show was all about kids living on an island in the Pacific, trying to survive day-to-day trials. The producers had gotten about 40 kids from all over America, ages 10 to 12, and dropped them off with supplies and instructions on how to survive. The host, Chris Mansworth, was a survival expert, and he would create challenges every day for the kids to complete. There were 4 teams of 10 kids, and the winner of each challenge got something cool for their area of the village. I watched the show religiously as a kid. Every Saturday night, right after The Simpsons, the show would come on, and I would be enthralled. I always imagined that I was on the island with them, surviving day to day. The challenges were really neat, too. They had kids gut and clean their own meat, dig wells by hand, build rafts for raft races, and make aqueducts so their village could have running water. It was a neat idea, but after 8 episodes, the show just kind of stopped. No new episodes came out, and the station never gave a reason. This was before the internet, so there was no way to check on updates online. So the show slipped off into obscurity, and my 10-year-old self just kind of forgot about it. I remembered the show again a few years ago, when Mom sent me a box of stuff from the attic. There were a couple of old VHS tapes in there, and between Batman, the animated series, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, were 8 tapes with handwritten labels that read Children of Men. We had a VHS recorder when I was a kid, and I can remember recording my favorite shows to watch later. I was excited to get to see the old show again, the memories flooding back as I started looking for the VHS player amongst the tapes in the box. There wasn't one, but a quick trip to Goodwill and $15, and I had a gently used VCR hooked up to my TV. I watched all 8 episodes back to back and fell in love with the show all over again. I remembered the kids I liked. Robert and Catherine were my favorites, but many of the kids had also been given a lot of screen time, and it was hard not to like them too. As I watched, I found myself wanting to see how the show ended over and over again. As I watched the show, I began to notice something a little darker under the surface too, something I hadn't noticed as a kid. The village was divided into 4 teams: green snakes, blue birds, red foxes, and brown mice. The teams had been divided up by background mostly, and it seemed very divisive to me as an adult. The green snakes did most of the hunting for the village, a lot of their kids having a rural background, while the brown mice did most of the farming and gathering because they came from a farm background. The red foxes were in charge of construction and upkeep. They were the smart kids, and they worked with the bluebirds, who were in charge of food management and cooking the meals. Every team had a representative who sat on a council. Robert was for the green snakes, Catherine for the bluebirds, Marco for the red foxes, and Shireen for the brown mice. As the show went on, it became very apparent that Robert didn't trust Marco, and with good reason. Marco and Shireen had formed a kind of alliance on their own, most of it because Marco bullied her into doing what he wanted. Robert and Catherine set up their own alliance, and Robert started holding out food to sway Shireen's decision. The village needed food, and Robert pointed out that he and Catherine were the ones providing it. Robert and Shireen wanted a fair split for everyone, but Marco tried to split them into class systems that would put his foxes at a higher tier. Robert didn't like that, and it became very clear that if Chris hadn't been there would have been a lot more fighting. Robert was a big 12-year-old, a stocky bruiser who won battles with his fists most of the time, and Chris had to separate him and Marco on more than one occasion. Marco was smaller, but definitely had charisma. He had most of the mice and all of the foxes on his side, and I wasn't sure how I missed all of this tension as a kid. It all came to a head on episode 6. Marco was caught hoarding food in the Red Fox village. It wasn't just food that the other teams had been bringing in either. He had been taking the comfort foods from the canteen the brown mice ran for the village and storing them in his hut. Robert discovered this and took Marco prisoner, demanding that he be placed on trial. The whole village was in an uproar, but Marco agreed to be confined to a central cabin until the council could rule on his trial. Chris was setting the whole trial up as an episode 8 for the viewers. At the end of episode 8, the council found Marco guilty, and the episode was ended with a lot of shaky camera work and the red foxes storming the podium where Marco was seated. That was how the show had ended. The little bell chimed overhead as I stepped into the tiny place. The store looked like a throwback. Sharp-looking rickety shelves that were covered in plastic VHS boxes and dust. The shelves held VHS tapes, Betamax, and DVD cases that were arranged neatly amongst the filth and dust. A quick look showed that they were all arranged alphabetically, like an ancient library of some sort. The shelves fronted onto a glass display case that held murky wonders within. On the counter was a TV, an ashtray stacked with old butts, and a greasy store clerk who smiled at me as I approached. "You the one who called about the tape?" he asked, showing a mouthful of stained teeth as he smiled. I had searched for months on my own. I had taken to the internet in an attempt to find something, anything that would give me some closure. Wikipedia told me that only 8 episodes were aired, but that 12 had been intended. I dug deeper and began to see that the show was a mystery all its own. The list of children that had been on the show was woefully incomplete. Marco and Robert were there, so were Catherine and Shireen, and Chris was there as the host, but none of the other children were named. No one except Chris Mansworth had gone on to do anything after the show, and his only contribution was his death a few months later. His Wikipedia said that he had committed suicide in his hotel room, and foul play was not suspected. As for the last 4 episodes of Children of Man, however, there was no mention. So I took to the usual online sleuths, Reddit, 4chan, TV message boards, but no one seemed to have the answer. Most people had never even heard of Children of Man, and the ones that had were more interested in my copies than the last 4 episodes. Apparently the episodes were never compiled or released for purchase, and the only means by which you could still see them were on VHS tapes like mine. I had several offers for them. One guy wanted to give me $500 per tape, but I declined and told him I'd post copies of the tapes for free if they wanted. That's how I met Charleston Hammer 462. He was a user on the hometown board of Reddit. He saw my post and the posted videos and got in contact with me about the place I was currently in. "Heard you were looking for a certain tape. In my line of work, when you're looking for something, you go talk to Reggie. He owns a shop in Burlington, South Carolina called Video Time Capsule. If you need a banned episode of a 70s drama or a never-aired documentary from the 60s, you talk to Reggie." I read the message a few times before responding. "Thanks, Charleston, but these episodes aren't just unaired. They're unknown. No one has ever seen them. I don't even know if they exist. And the store you're talking about is 400 miles away." When I hit send on the message, I figured I'd never hear from him again. It took him an hour to respond, but he got back with me. What you're after is very rare. I used to watch Children of Man myself when I was younger. It ended so abruptly that it's been an internet mystery since the net was just message boards and wells. I didn't learn about the last 4 episodes, though, until I met Reggie at TVCon. We got to talking about old TV shows, and after a few drinks, he told me he had the last 4 episodes of Children of Men. I perked up. "Have you seen them?" That response took a little longer. "I have. It's some pretty different stuff. I won't ruin it for you, but if you value the way you remember the show, don't watch it. There's a reason these episodes never made it to air. Here's the number to the store. If it's late, call him anyway. Reggie keeps weird hours, and sometimes that store's open 24 hours a day. He's an eccentric dude, don't doubt, but he has what you're looking for." The number was at the bottom of the message. "Yeah," I said, no longer quite sure what I was doing here. "Yeah, I called about the complete series of Children of Men." He nodded, reached under the counter, and slapped a plain white case onto it. "All 8 episodes, recorded as aired," he said, studying me. I frowned. "I'm after the last 4 episodes." His piggy eyes glinted behind the grease-smeared glasses. "There were only 8 episodes aired. And you told me you had the other 4 that never aired." He smiled, and it did ghastly things to his porcine face. "Had to make sure. Come to the back." And with that, he disappeared behind the curtain into the back room. I walked around, hesitating for a moment as I touched the curtain, and followed him. I'd come 400 miles, might as well go 5 feet into hell. The phone rang 6 times. I was just about to hang up when someone answered and spoke through a mouthful of food. I didn't understand him, but once he'd swallowed whatever he'd had in his mouth, he tried again. "Video time capsule, where your memories are always on sale." What a tagline. "Yes, I'm looking for something specific." The sound of something being stuffed into the speaker's mouth and chewed loudly assaulted my ears as he continued. "Aren't they all? What you looking for?" Clearly, customer service was not his strong suit. Episodes 9 through 12 of Children of Man. I heard something hit the floor, and the speaker cursed loudly. "Yeah, you must be mistaken. There are only 8 episodes of Children of Man." "Look," I said a little hotly, "I was told that you have things that no one else does. I want to see those episodes. I don't even want to buy them. I was just told that you have them in your possession. Is there any way that I can just—" $500, the voice returned, and the tone was not to be bargained with. "In cash, before I will even let you see them." I agreed, despite the outrageous price, and now I was here in the grungy shop, preparing to go into the back. The back was worse than the front. DVDs and VHS tapes were stacked into teetering piles. The back room was lit by only a few dingy overheads, and I could see an old TV casting its glow from the back. The floor was riddled with trash, and I swear you could hear the mice scampering around to get out of my way. What sort of videos could you find in here? Would this place give me anything but heartbreak? This seemed like the setup for 1,000 scary stories, and I suddenly didn't want to see these mysterious artifacts. But like anyone else who comes to find things that they want, I needed to see them. Reggie was waiting by the TV. He had an ancient set that looked very similar to the one my parents had owned. On top of it was a VHS DVD combo player that had a set of rabbit ears stuck out of it like a weather vane. There was a wooden chair in front of it with a little blue pad on it. Reggie held up a hand. $500, he said. I reached into my pocket, but I paused. How do I know it's authentic? "Look, I could get into a lot of trouble for even owning this, okay? You think guys who possess child porn go to prison for a long time? This would put me under the prison for life. If you want to see those episodes, then I need the money. Are we doing business or what?" I handed him the money, and he popped the cassette tape in and walked away. "Not joining me?" I asked. "Not for another $500, kid." I heard the curtains rustle, and the show began. Episode 9 gave us a recap of the trial, and then the storming of the stage. When the show started, I noticed a distinct lapse in the film quality. Whoever was operating the camera was just shorter than the usual crew members, and they seemed barely able to lift the heavy rig. Finally, the camera had Robert in frame, and he began to fill us in on what was happening in the village. "It's been about 3 days since Marco's trial and his escape. Since then, Fox Village has been separated from our village. They took most of the brown mice with them, and now they're trying to raid us every night for food. Something's going on over there. We heard shouts this morning, and..." At that point, the shouts got louder, and Robert ran off screen as the camera tried to follow him. We came to the edge of Red Fox Village. Many of the huts that were once on the verge had been burnt out, making a kind of barricade between them and the rest of the village. Many voices were cheering as something swung from the tree. At first, I thought it was just an effigy, a dummy maybe, but then suddenly I realized it was Shireen. She hung like a grotesque wind chime in the space between the villages, and Robert shouted for Marco to stop being a coward and come out. Some of the kids were crying, but everyone on the other side cheered and shouted, "Traitor!" or "Faithless!" at the swinging body of Shireen. I sat glued to the TV, unsure if any of this was even real. It was night when the next recording resumed. It seemed that whoever was running the camera wanted us to see a raid. The night vision on the camera showed kids with torches fighting other kids who were leaving their storehouse in a hurry. The Kids with torches hacked at them with machetes, blood flying as they connected, and some of them dropped as they were stabbed or hacked to pieces by the blades of the other children. The rest of the episode was mostly uneventful. Lots of shaky cam, lots of crying, and at one point someone dropped it and didn't pick it up again for several minutes. As the episode ended, I was left looking at my own stark face looking back at me. What had I just watched? There was no way this could be the same show. Things had gone very Lord of the Flies in the village, and as the 10th episode started, I wasn't sure what to expect. Episode 10 started without preamble. There was no recap, no theme music, and the footage looked unedited. We see a much more professional camera crew, and Chris Mansworth trying to bring some order back to the island. They're coming up through the shallows, Chris and about 10 adults, coming up in the dark towards the village. Chris was talking about how it had all gotten so out of hand, and how he was going to try to rescue the kids. As they came into the seemingly empty village, Chris cupped his hands and began to shout at the empty huts. He told them that the game was over, and that it was time they went home. He told them that there was a boat that would take them home, but there was still no response. He moved deeper into the collection of straw huts, the fires burning low around him, and that was when they struck. Kids with spears, kids with machetes, came screaming out of the darkness, and the cameramen backpedaled furiously as the adults were completely taken by surprise. Blood flew, legs were sawed off as pint-sized pygmies hacked and chopped, and Chris Mansworth was buried under a pile of children as he screamed and flailed. As the cameraman tripped and went down, we see the shadow of a child standing over him as the spear comes down as well. The episode ended very abruptly. I was speechless. What the hell had happened to them? These were kids that had been doing challenges and making friends. The rivalry between Robert and Marco had always been the most serious part of the show, but now they had devolved into savagery. The 11th episode was about 10 minutes long. It opened on a stationary camera shot of the same space where they had held the trial. Marco was on his knees before the camera, and he looked bad. His left eye was a puffy mass of bruised tissue. His left ear was a bleeding stump. His nose looked to be cut jaggedly. He was weeping silently, and his tears were thick and bloody. Robert stood behind him. He had always worn a white football jersey in every episode I'd seen him in, but the garment was stained red and brown now. He bled from several places on his chest, and when he raised his machete, it was with obvious pain. This morning, before the sun had risen, this dog attempted to attack our village. He violated the rules of war as agreed upon by he and I. We agreed to a battle between our two villages at dawn. This snake tried to attack us in the night and lost. Thus his village is forfeit. As the winner, I sentence him to death. Please, Robert, Mansworth said, his voice off screen. The show's over. We can all go home now, back to your parents. It doesn't have to end like this. As Marco cried his terrible tears, Robert looked at Chris off screen and turned back to his enemy. The show is over. This is our home now. He brought the machete down. Marco cried out and fell face first onto the ground. Robert fell on him, hitting him with the machete again and again. Blood sprayed from the struggling child, and when Robert looked back at the camera, his face was spattered with gore. He reached out, and the camera went off abruptly. The last episode was only a few minutes. It started with a shaky cam journey through the jungle. The runner was being pursued. I could hear the footsteps behind him. As the runner got to the shore, he jumped onto something and pushed it into the water. The wooden deck of a boat came into view, and as he drifted out, I could hear oars working in the water. He sat the camera on the seat as he rowed, and the faces of children could be seen in the surrounding jungle. Then, everything went dark. The tape clicked, and the TV went back to static. I left it in the VCR and stumbled out of the back room. Reggie was sitting behind the counter and looked up at me with something like sympathy. He held something back towards me, and I saw it was my money. I shook my head and stepped away from him. I had bought a ticket, and I had paid the price. "You okay?" "Yeah. So, what happened to the kids? They just left them there?" Reggie shrugged. "Coast Guard picked up Mansworth about 2 days later. He was drifting in the ocean and looked extremely rattled. He wouldn't tell them how he had gotten out there or where he had been. When he got back, he gave the tapes to the studio, and the next time anyone saw him, he was dead." And the kids? The studio never pursued the show. Never sold the aired episodes. They never even tried to air what Chris had brought back. They just made the whole thing disappear. I suppose there's an island out there full of kids who wanted to be on a TV show and just never came back. Their parents were likely told there had been an accident or something. The whole thing was hushed up and eventually people forgot. You'll forget one day too, he added, as though he thought it might help. As I lay in bed now, trying to forget the horrible things I saw, I hope I do forget, but I doubt I ever will. So if you ever find an island out in the Pacific, maybe one full of locals that look just a little not right, turn your boat back out of sight. Those natives are not friendly. Rachel, are you sitting right in front of that television again? Came her mother's high, reedy voice from the kitchen. No, Rachel called back, her voice incredulous, as if her mom would just assume something like that. Like she'd just hear the TV, always television to her, and always in the tone of deepest scorn, and assume that Rachel was sitting 5 feet from it. In truth, it would have likely been easier to split the atom than slide a piece of notebook paper between Rachel's face and the murky glow of the old television set. Like most of the children who had reached the age of 10 in this time of technological marvels, Rachel found her entire world balanced within the glow of that box. In it were held the 500 TV channels of her life. Sports, cartoons, news, cartoons, current events, cartoons, and the scary movies that her mother would have had a fit if she knew she were watching. Rachel quickly spooled the channels through to the 5 or 6 that showed scary movies, being careful to move the volume down to 2 little green bumps that would ensure her mother didn't hear the TV. Her mother would have an absolute coronary if she knew Rachel was watching anything that wasn't approved family television by the Council for Moral and Ethical Values. Even in her head, Rachel always assumed this name was delivered in a reedy, nasal voice of a cultured and obviously boring old man. The whole town was like that, so caught up in their own ancient sense of what was right and wrong that they didn't seem to understand that times were changing. It was like Burrow was caught in the 50s sometimes. All the kids in town lived on their TVs. It was just a way of life. She spooled through the TV guide and saw that 3 movies were playing later that she wanted to see. Carrie was playing at 10:30, but that was much too soon. Her mother might be good and asleep by 11, but not by 10:30. The other channel, however, was showing Child's Play at 10:30, followed by something called Darkhaven. As she read the description, she knew that Darkhaven was the one she wanted to see tonight. The description sounded pretty cool, and it promised a true scare not often found in modern horror. The runtime was just over an hour, too, so even if her mom woke up at 2, as she was sometimes wont to do, she could easily be back in bed and well asleep before. And what is this? Rachel squeaked a little, and the remote clattered to the floor. Batteries rolled hither and thither as the back cover came off, and she turned her head to see her mother hovering over her. Rachel's mother wasn't an unattractive woman, but the worry lines and stress a pair of jobs brought on her had worn her down before her time. She now stood, legs spread in a linebacker's blocking stance, with her thick blonde hair thrown hastily into a messy tail, and her hands covered in the remains of tonight's dinner dish suds. Her face wasn't set cruelly, despite what Rachel thought. She'd never once seen anything more than parental displeasure from her mother. She was wearing the stern look she reserved just for Rachel, though, it seemed. "Nothing," Rachel said again. Just trying to give herself nightmares for the next 500 years, she said as she bent down and pushed the button on the front of the TV. It went off with a little staticky smack sound that reduced it to nothing but a dumb, lifeless box. "Off to bed now. It's well past your bedtime. The idea that I'd allow such filth in my—" But Rachel had listened to just about as much as she cared to of that. She'd frozen on the bottom step like a ballet dancer, preparing for her opening move. And what an opening move this was likely to be. "They aren't filth, Mother. I happen to like horror movies. If you weren't so close-minded, maybe you'd find out that you like them too." Her mother's stern face had flushed red at that, the deep scarlet it always turned before the two had one of their more and more common arguments. "Don't you dare take that short tone with me, young lady. This is still my house, and as long as you live in my house, you will follow my rules, and you can forget about TV for 2 days because of your sass." Rachel was affronted, but But that's not fair. What am I supposed to do for 2 days? There's nothing else to do in this stupid town. No one ever wants to play outside or come over to visit. They all just want to watch TV. Well, for 2 days, I guess you won't be one of them. Maybe you can be the first one to actually go out, and why don't you just admit it? Why don't you just admit that you hate me? Why don't you just admit that you love making my life miserable? A silence hung between them for a minute. Rachel was walking down a dark path, but she didn't care. She knew that what she would do next would hurt her mother, hurt her worse than she'd ever hurt her before, but she didn't care. And just where did you get an idea like that? Why would I hate you? Her mother's voice was incredulous and low, as though it was all she could do to breathe out the words. I heard you once, talking to Mrs. Dempsey, talking about all the things you'd do if only you didn't have children. All the exciting things the two of you would do if only you didn't have children at home to take care of. Well, why don't you just go and do them? Because I honestly wish that I didn't have a mother. She didn't even stop to see how deeply she had wounded her. She stormed upstairs and slammed her door shut between herself and the whole stupid world. She came awake all at once and looked over at the clock on her bedside table. 11:30 p.m. She couldn't believe she'd dozed off. What if she'd missed it? She'd already had to miss Child's Play thanks to her mother's stupid racket. She rolled away from the clock and couldn't help feeling sorry for her mother. She'd expected another fight, a longer punishment maybe. She might have even sassed her way into what her friends called a spanking, which her mother had never believed in. Instead, she'd just cried. Rachel had heard her climb the stairs from underneath her covers and was sure that the door would open any minute. Her mother would come storming in with a belt or a paddle or maybe even just her hand and a still glowering rage at her cheeky daughter. But instead, she just went to bed. She'd opened her door and flopped out onto the big bed she'd once shared with Rachel's father before he left, and began to cry. Rachel couldn't remember ever hearing her mother cry, not even when she was 3. Her father had left, saying it just wasn't working out. He didn't love Rachel's mother anymore, and hadn't even bothered to say anything to Rachel. For the better part of an hour, her mother had sobbed furiously, choked anguished sobs that she didn't think would ever end, at least until she'd heard them change into deep, rhythmic snores. This had been at about 10:05, but Rachel hadn't dared to sneak down to the TV. Her mother could be shamming, though Rachel didn't think she was. Rachel didn't want to risk missing the movie she really wanted to see because she had been too hasty. She'd seen Child's Play about 100 times anyway, and had decided to close her eyes just for a second when 11:35 p.m. She'd sneak down to the living room in about 20 minutes, just to make sure that her mother was still good and asleep. No sense spoiling it now by being overeager. She rolled over, and her guilt rolled with her. She shouldn't have said that to her mom. It wasn't fair, and thinking about it now, her mother probably meant nothing by it. Whose mother didn't want a life where they didn't have responsibilities or children? Rachel was mature enough to understand that, but 11:38 p.m. But it was still a rotten thing to say. Rachel was here, and her mother thinking that way made her feel like she didn't care whether she lived or died. And she was always such a bother anyway. Rachel, clean your room. Rachel, finish your vegetables. That's not appropriate subject matter for a child your age, Rachel. What did she know anyway? Who was she to judge what was and wasn't right for her to do? 11:39 p.m. Rachel rolled over angrily, and now time was being slow on purpose. She listened closely again and could still hear her mother's deep snoring from the other room. She could probably sneak down right now and catch the climactic ending of Child's Play. Her mother would never be the wiser. But no, Rachel wouldn't spoil it for a bad slasher flick ending that she'd seen 100 times. She'd bide her time until 11:41 p.m. She was sure that she could sneak down and not get caught. She felt her eyes getting heavy again and stifled a yawn. She would not get tired and fall asleep. That was not an option. She lasted this long, and she would last a little longer. She'd have to make sure she didn't fall asleep on the couch or something, like that one time a few months ago. Luckily, her mom hadn't woken up till nearly 7 after the storm had knocked the power out. The TV had been off, and all she'd been able to yell at her for was not waking her up and falling asleep on the couch. Oh, but hadn't that been a good night? Watching Ether Man during a rainstorm, and having to stifle a scream when the lightning had peeled out just as the knife slash had landed. 11:43 p.m. Rachel threw the covers off angrily. If time wasn't going to cooperate, then she'd just go ahead and risk it. She pulled on her fluffy pink slippers and her black bathrobe for night sneaking and opened the door to her room carefully. It gave one or two traitorous squeaks, but they were small ones. Her mother's breathing never altered in the least. She slunk carefully into the hallway, past her mother's door, and down the steps as she tried hard to avoid the loose 8th step. Finally, she was down in the living room. She flipped on the TV and was bathed instantly in its warm, staticky glow. It was on the right channel, too. Child's Play was just ending, the credits beginning to roll, and the volume was still at the right level for night watching. She reclined against the couch as she waited for the letters to glide slowly to an end. She folded over herself and took a pillow off the couch to rest her head against. As the last name spilled sluggishly by, the screen lit up with a short infomercial about stock in a growing business firm. She flipped on the info button and read the description of Darkhaven again. As the smiling cowboy-hatted speaker finally delivered his tagline, "So put your trust in smiling Walter Rigsby, and you'll see the returns growing like our condos." Then the screen went eerily dark for what felt like hours. When it lit again, it was panning in on a dark forest, probably one in New England or Maine, and Rachel was accosted by the creepy circus grind of the intro music. She sighed. She couldn't believe she'd be missing TV for 2 days because of a slop-budget late 70s B-movie. The production value looked shoddy, even to a 10-year-old, and the camera work looked like some guy with a camcorder had shot it. She shrugged. Might as well see how it played out. It was only an hour and change anyway. The story started slow. Some settlers on a boat were in a bad storm, one of those Christopher Columbus specials with masts and lots of wood. A man on board was writing to his wife about how he missed her and wished she'd come with him to the new colony. There was some flashbacks, him arguing with some other buckle hat guy and asking some others to leave with him. Then a guy burst into his cabin and told him he was needed on deck. The following scene had been a little cool. Some of the men that came up to help had been washed overboard as they tried to save the ship. The actors were doing a pretty good job of drowning as the boat sailed away, unable to rescue them, though they were certainly trying with all they had. It got boring again pretty quick after they landed. Lots of farming, lots of good morrows and banter. There was one old woman they seemed to think was a witch, but they left her alone instead of burning her like they usually did in these types of movies. Rachel was starting to nod off when an Indian came into town one day, accompanied by some equally as unbelievably white-looking Indians. He told the letter writer, who was their mayor or leader or something, that they had settled on sacred ground to the local tribe, and that they would have to move the town or suffer the Indians' wrath. This led to a good little stretch of Indians returning nightly to burn their houses and kill people. Believably kill people, too. When one Indian brave buried his tomahawk in one of the settlers, she wasn't honestly sure she could see the effects that made the blood splatter. The scalping looked pretty grisly, too, as did the horse dragging and the execution of the braves they caught during the attack. This progressed until the people of the village had gathered to try to find a way to stop the Indians from attacking Darkhaven. The Indians had called it Darkhaven in their native tongue, and so some of the settlers had taken to calling it that too. Rachel was interested by this point. The movie had turned out to be not only very gory, but also very grabbing. She couldn't remember why it had been boring before. Suddenly, every character seemed more than real, and every death was as real as it would have been if it had been one of her own family members. The village's salvation came from an unexpected source. The old witch woman turned out to have a book that told her how to call forth a terrible power. "He will crush the savages," she told them, "in exchange for a pure soul." The townspeople then, with little to no discussion it seemed, rushed out to find a virgin, despite the protests of their leader and the local priest. Rachel sat close, a paper's breadth between her and the TV. They took a young woman and strapped her to the ground. The old witch cackled as she drew around the sobbing girl in the dirt, and the woman screamed and writhed as she pulled at her chains. She begged them to release her, tears pouring down her face as the old hag began to work her magic. The townspeople, for their part, mostly just stood around and looked somber and embarrassed. They didn't seem to know what to do here, and as the witch's spell began, many seemed to have second thoughts. It was too late, though. The drawing in the dirt began to glow painfully bright, and thrum in a dark crystal and purple that made Rachel squint. The woman screamed and screamed as the black ooze spilled from the ground. The ooze rolled over her dress, up her legs, and slid into her mouth with... The scene suddenly turned to snow. Signal lost. "No!" Rachel howled, throwing a hand over her mouth a second later to stifle the furious scream that would have followed. She began to pound her fist on the glass eye that so cruelly cheated her. She began to scream as loud as she dared at this hateful little monster of glass and plastic. She hated it. It built her up, and then snatched her prize away at the last minute. She hated it so much she... Her hand made a wet sound as she struck the screen. She pulled her fist back and looked down at the darkened surface. What was that? She held it to the salt and pepper snow of the television and looked in confusion at the dark liquid on her fist. Was that mud? Is her hand covered in... Good God! As she looked down at the slick substance on the underside of her curled fist, it writhed and pulled away from her skin slightly. No, it was a trick of the light. It had to be. It had to be blood or something. She'd burst a vessel, slamming her stupid hand against the TV. That had to be it. It couldn't... Plop. She looked up. Plop. Something was falling out of the TV. Plop. Plop. Was it her blood? There seemed to be an awful lot of it. It pooled on the carpet before her eyes, coming out in rivulets from the staticky eye. It soaked into the thick tangle of shaggy carpet, and Rachel scuttled crab-like away from it. One huge piece fell from the center of the snow. It's quivering. It's beating, Rachel thought. She didn't know why she thought this until something solid floated to the top of the pool. It rolled drunkenly in the murk, and as it rolled, it began to pulsate, to throb, to send little ripples out from the pulsating mass. It was a heart. The goop began to move, congealing, and then lifting itself up bonelessly like a waterspout from the world's darkest puddle. It hung there looking at her as it studied her scared face. Though it had no eyes, she knew it looked. She felt her breath coming in stuttering skips as she stared into the scariest thing she had ever seen in her whole life. It wavered like the jello her mother sometimes made for dessert. Then one thin leg broke from the black surge and took a liquid step towards her. She was over the couch in a flash and watched as it buckled and fell juicily against the coffee table, full of old art books her mother had lovingly kept there. It splattered and covered the chintzy farmscape, but then drew itself back together quickly as it began to assume a more human form. Its arms and legs were too thin, its torso like one of those department store mannequins she'd seen in Woolworth's, and its head was a vague oval with a sleek, featureless face. But still, she knew it saw her. Her fear grabbed her fully, but unlike most children, her fear always transferred into flight. She took to the stairs 3 at a time. She drove through her bedroom door and slammed it shut behind her. It rattled and buckled not a heartbeat later, and came open with a monstrous crunch. She was thrown like a rag doll across the room and onto her own bed. The creature was inside, already lunging towards her. It tripped on those 2 thin legs, though, and one of them connected with her beanbag chair. She leapt over it. She was out of her room again, slamming the door shut behind her as the creature gained its feet again. She ran to her mother's room, her fists sounding like cannon shots as she banged frantically on the door. "Mom! Mommy! Please! Help me!" Her mother, dressed in the same rumpled clothes she'd come home in, threw the door open, brandishing a long wooden bat as she came into the hallway. She looked left, looked right, and then dropped panting to clutch at Rachel. "Honey? Rachel, what's wrong?" "A man, a thing, it's in my room, it's... But then she realized with real terror that it hadn't followed her. Something that quick should have been through the door and after her in a heartbeat. She looked back at the closed door, and dread began to coil there. Why hadn't it come after her? Rachel's mother looked at the door, and then pushed her daughter behind her. "I'll go have a look. You stay here. Call 911 if something happens." "No, Mom, please. Please don't leave me. Let's go call them now, and they can..." But she was down the hall, and to the door faster than the creature could have even managed. Her mother put herself against the wall like a SWAT cop preparing to burst into a drug house. She brought her foot up and kicked the door, and Rachel cringed and closed her eyes, expecting the thing to leap on her mother in 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. No screaming, no yelling, nothing. She opened her eyes and saw her mother walking around the room, checking in the closet, looking under the bed, behind the furniture. She had turned on the lights, and with it, it didn't seem half so scary as it had a minute ago. Her mother swept the entire room 3 times, baseball bat at the ready, but after the 3rd time, she shrugged and turned back to her still shivering daughter. "Well, No boogeyman, Rachel. No monsters, no shadows. But I did find this little creature waiting patiently for you to stumble over him. She held out a well-worn teddy that Rachel had had since she was a baby. She'd put it on top of her closet. It seemed childish to have something like that on her bed at her age, but she was honestly glad to see it now. Her mother smiled and took a step towards the door. "Look who doesn't need a mother now, huh?" she said, not in her snippy ha-ha voice, but in her warm mother voice Rachel had heard less and less of these days, and would never hear again. Before she made it halfway to the threshold, the light on her table popped off with a smell like burning plastic. Rachel's mother turned to look at it, her face now cut in half by the darkness. But only Rachel saw the thin sliver of darkness that wrapped lovingly around her ankle. Her mother registered it a moment before it went taut as a noose, and Rachel saw a sad mix of terror, regret, and savage resolve to fight anything that threatened her child. Surprise and bemusement at the thought of being so vulnerable in her own home snap across her mother's face. "Rachel," she said, before she was dragged bonelessly to the floor and pulled, hardwood ribbons rising from her fingernails, under the bed. The baseball bat made a queer hollow plink as it hit the floor, a heartbeat before that ragged old bear. By then, though, her mother had disappeared an eternity ago to her daughter's eyes, into the inky blackness beneath her bed. The door slammed, and Rachel was left alone in the hallway. Have you ever had a dream, maybe a memory from your childhood, so vivid that it almost has to be real? I'm not sure if this actually happened or not, but I've dreamed about it for the last 2 weeks, and I'm terrified that it will never stop. Whenever I close my eyes, it begins again, and each time, it's more vivid than the last. This isn't normal for me. Most days I couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast this morning, much less every detail of the dreams I had last night. But I can tell you every single detail of this event as though it happened just a second ago. It's the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen in my 30 years of life. And if it doesn't stop soon, I don't know what I'll do. I was 8 years old when I knew what terror really was. Miss Winkler was teaching us math, her blackboard covered in numbers and mathematical symbols, when my hand came up, my chubby fingers tickling the sky in anticipation. She'd been trying to engage us for about 45 minutes, enticing slivers of answers out of kids who'd rather be playing outside or pretending to be Power Rangers. When my hand came up, she looked so hopeful. Maybe she thought she had finally reached a student, perhaps. Maybe she thought she'd finally had a breakthrough, and a student would begin to return her answers to her. When she called on me, I can still see the hopeful smile that stretched her painted lips as she said my name with great expectation. Unfortunately, I was about to break her heart. "Can I go to the bathroom, Miss Winkler?" I asked in my high, innocent voice. Her face fell, and as an adult, I can understand that disappointment. "Yes, take the Hallpass when you go." The Hallpass was a ruler with the word Hallpass written on it in magic marker. It was smudged from many dirty hands, and as I took it up and left the room, my adult mind wondered how many other hands had touched it over the years. As a kid, all I had wondered about was whether or not I could use it as a convincing lightsaber. I suppose kids do have different priorities, don't they? I swished and buzzed it all the way to the bathroom, and as I came up to the squat little building, I felt nothing besides a need to pee. The brick building was large enough to hold 2 bathrooms, a boys' and a girls', and 4 students comfortably inside each. I remember it being cold and damp in the winter, but I thought it would be mercifully cool on this blistering summer day. As I pushed the door open, I felt cold air ruffle my hair. Today, though, something didn't feel quite right about this place. The darkness was oppressive, pervasive, and even as a child, I could feel that something was different. I reached inside and groped for the light switch. My hand slid over the slimy walls, but found nothing. I knew there should be a light switch here, but as I scrambled my hand over the moist tiles, I became more and more aware of how badly I needed to pee. I finally decided to just go use the stall in the dark, the dingy windows letting in enough light that I wouldn't be in complete darkness. The door swung shut behind me. I felt the air pull it closed very hard, and the sound echoed off the bathroom walls. The dingy windows showed me 2 urinals and 2 walled-off toilet stalls. I went into one of the stalls, always feeling more comfortable sitting down to use the bathroom, and got comfortable as my bladder began to empty itself. As I started to do my business, I became aware of the strange noise from the stall next to me. The stalls were made of concrete blocks, painted glossy white, but they were not entirely built into the floor. There was a small opening at the bottom, about a foot high, where you could see into the stall next door. As I sat in the greasy semi-light, I heard the sound like mud dripping onto the floor. Every 5 seconds, it would glop, glop, glop onto the floor. Underneath the sound was another, softer, wetter, heavy breathing that was so low it was almost inaudible. I had finished using the bathroom by this point, but the sound mesmerized me. I had never heard anything like it, and I was fascinated and terrified to see what made a sound like that. Slowly I bent down so I could look under the wall, too afraid to simply go open the stall and see what was in there. As my knees bent to the cold concrete and my hands splayed over the rough floor, I brought my eyes down to peek and saw something that I will never forget. If it was dingy dark in my stall, then it was nearly pitch black in the other. As my eyes adjusted, I could see something on the other side that looked like nothing so much as rippling mud or swaying pudding. It was a mass, a wiggling mass of something that nearly blocked out the entire opening. As I watched, it rippled and shook endlessly as the sound of wet, labored breathing only got louder. Before long, it was more than background noise. It covered the dripping gloop with its damp and difficult chorus. I couldn't look away. I couldn't drag myself away from it until something round and angry floated through the muck and seemed to see me seeing it. It was an eye. I was up in a heartbeat, legs drawn up to my chest as I sat on the toilet and clutched myself. I held the ruler to my chest like a makeshift weapon and tried to silence my growing terror as the breathing became growly and agitated. The door burst open on the other stall, and I thanked my lucky stars that I had remembered to lock the door to my own cubicle before starting my business. Whatever was on the other side banged against the door. It sounded like waves crashing against a levee, and all I could do was cower and try not to scream, worried it might excite the creature and push it to further violence. It slammed in again and again, and as it did, I almost thought I could feel flecks of whatever it was made of slapping off and splatting on the ceiling and floor. It battered the door mercilessly, and to my horror, I could see the simple slide lock joggling and shuddering under every blow. The sound it made was like a mudslide, like mud pushing its way through a hallway during a flood, and I just knew that any minute it would break the door and cover me. Then it stopped. Whatever it was gave one final slap against the door, and then rumbled off out of the bathroom. I sat petrified, unable to move for nearly 5 minutes, before I finally found myself able to control my shaking legs. It was gone. Whatever it was gone, but I wanted it to be gone and well gone before I decided to come out. The lock didn't want to open, but it popped open after a few hard slaps with my hand. The door creaked outward on warped hinges, and I could tell that the cubicle door was definitely going to need replacing. As I turned to look at it, I could see several dark stains on the outside where something had slammed its soupy body into it again and again. Something dripped onto my shoulder, and my scream peeled off the walls like a startled bird. I scuttled back on crab legs. My knees had buckled, and I watched as something thick and muddy dripped off the ceiling and fell onto the cracked tile. I looked up to see a dozen or more little stalagmites, or maybe they were stalactites, hanging from the ceiling. They oozed and threatened to fall, their creation having taken place very recently. At that moment, all I wanted to do was get out, to escape, but I should have known that it wouldn't be that easy. When I pushed the door open, it didn't swing out onto the yellowing grass of my school sports field, but onto a shadowy hellscape of swirling lights and acrid smells. My child's mind didn't understand everything, didn't even understand some of the things, but it did understand that there were many moving mountains out there that made the one in the bathroom look like an anthill. The smaller ones congregated around towering fires, the dusty brown earth scraped shiny by their passing, and around them seemed to grind mountains that towered up into the greasy sky. Their tops were illuminated by infrequent forks of lightning, I could see towering rock sentinels made of ever-flowing viscous earth. It was too much. I closed the door and crumpled into a corner between the dripping sink and the wall. I made myself as small as possible. I felt as a bug must feel when it's surrounded by humans, and as my mind tried to process what I had seen, I seemed on the verge of breaking. How could I process something so big without going insane? The smallest of them had been barely able to be contained by this building. The largest of them could have destroyed this building without thinking. My mind could not fathom the sheer size of them, the knowledge of these moving mountains, so I did the only thing I could to keep myself from going insane. I put myself to sleep. The janitor found me there, and when he touched my shoulder, he said I fought and screamed like a cornered animal. He didn't mind, though. He was glad he had found me. It was night when he took me out of the little toilet building, and he had to be very firm with me to get me to go outside into the gloom. I was afraid it was a trick. The dark reminded me of the greasy blackness of that place, and it wasn't until my mother saw us coming out and ran to me that I knew I was back where I belonged. They took me to the principal's office. My dad, my teacher, the principal, the police officers, they were all waiting there for me. My dad hugged me, folding me into his warm embrace, and my teachers and principals asked me where I had been. When the janitor said he had found me in the toilet, my teacher seemed confused, and the police seemed aggravated. "You said you searched the entire school," said the principal, not just to my teacher, but also to the police officers. "We did. We even brought the dogs in. There's no way that kid's been in the bathroom for 2 days. My face must have shown how confused I was as I tried my best to follow the explanation. They told me I'd been missing for 2 days. The school had been searched, a Code Adam had been ongoing, and they had searched every place I liked and every friend's house I'd ever been to. I tried to tell them about the monsters, about the weird world full of giant things, but they just shook their heads and said I must have been hiding this whole time. I think my parents were just happy that I was safe, and the principal didn't punish me, even though I sensed that he really wanted to. I think my teacher believed me when I told her I wasn't hiding, holding the Hallpass out to her in a shaky hand. She knew I was a good kid, and didn't usually cause more than the average 8-year-old's amount of trouble. She quit the next year, and I was removed from her class at my parents' request. When she saw me in the halls after that, I could swear that she looked almost sad to see me. I haven't thought about that place in years. After it happened, my parents took me to see a psychiatrist, and she helped me put it out of my mind. I would only remember it sometimes in the dark hours of the night, but it was gone just as quickly. Even though it comes back in vivid detail, and I don't know how much longer I can handle it. I see the mountains moving as I stand in the doorway of that bathroom. I know that they will end me if they see me. I know that if they see a way to our world, they will end all of us. And I'm afraid of what I'll see the next time I open that door.